the early 1970s, the alphabet murderer stalked Rochester, New York, killing girls who had the same first and last initial. These horrific crimes remain unsolved until this very day. On the evening of November the 16th, 1971, 10-year-old Carmen Colon ran down the side of the highway in upstate New York. This little girl was waving her arms as she ran from a car that was backing towards her on the shoulder. She was nude from the waist down. At least 100 vehicles passed her, yet no one, not one of the vehicles, stopped to try to help her. 10 days later, police found her dead body in a nearby gully. Carmen Colon's murder was only the first of the still unsolved alphabet murders. This was a series of murders on girls ages 10 and 11 years old. These murders occurred between 1971 and 1973 in Rochester, New York. Each of these girls' first and last name had the same letter, and each of their bodies was located in or near a town with the same first letter as their first and last names. Carmen Colon was the first victim. Her mother had sent her to a local drugstore to pick up a prescription, and the drugstore was located only a block and a half away from her house. Once Carmen arrived at the pharmacy, she talked to the pharmacist for a few minutes, and then she walked back outside to wait for the prescription to be filled. Carmen never went back into the drugstore, and she never returned to her home. Carmen's mother called the police, and the neighborhood was searched, but Carmen could not be found. And then 2 days later, a couple of teenagers riding their bicycles in the Chile community near Rochester found little Carmen's deceased body in a gully ditch. She had been manually strangled after being AR'd. Her little skull and one of her vertebrae were fractured. This is according to her autopsy. Additionally, her torso had several fingernail scratches. Intense public outcry was sparked by both Colon's murder and the fact that no one had even tried to stop and save this kidnapped little girl when they saw her trying to escape along Interstate 490. With no leads and no one coming forward who may have seen Carmen, billboards were placed around the Rochester area pleading for information about Carmen's death. There was also a $6,000 no questions asked reward for any information leading to the arrest of Carmen's killer. But still, no one came forward, and Carmen's murder remained unsolved. For over a year, police looked for Carmen's killer. Then, on April the 2nd, 1973, 11-year-old Wanda Wakowiz's mother had sent her to their local grocery store to pick up a few items for their dinner. Wanda spent $8.52 in the grocery store. After leaving the store, Wanda vanished and she was never seen again. The next day, on April the 3rd, 1973, at 10:15 a.m., a New York State trooper, while on patrol, located Wanda's little body at the bottom of an embankment at a rest area off of State Route 104 in Webster, New York. Wanda's autopsy found that she had been AR'd before being strangled from behind with something, most likely a belt. Wanda had fought back with her killer. This is shown by several defensive wounds. Her body had also been dressed after her death. Her body had signs of pubic hair and semen. And according to the autopsy, several strands of white cat fur were also discovered on her clothing, despite her family not owning a pet with white fur. Police were able to link the murders to being committed, most likely by the same person. Both girls were around the same age, 10 and 11. They both disappeared around the same time in the afternoon, and they had both been strangled and essayed. With this latest crime, the Rochester community was on high alert. Many parents kept their children inside, especially if their first and last names began with the same letter. Several leads came in, with one even alleging that they saw Wanda getting into a light tannish-colored vehicle when she was leaving the grocery store. A person contacted the police and reported seeing a man shoving a red-haired little girl who matched Wanda's description into a light-colored Dodge Dart on Conkey Avenue, and this was around 5:30 and 6 p.m. the night of her disappearance. Even with the many reports and leads, nothing panned out. Police had also noted the possibility of the victims being linked to the same killer, with the similarity in ages as well as both of their first and last initials having the same first letter, as well as the community they lived in or where their bodies were found having the same first letter. November the 26th, 1973, 6 months after Wanda's murder, 11-year-old Michelle Maenza, also from Rochester community, vanished while walking home from her local shopping center. 2 days later, police found her body fully clothed and laying face down in a ditch in Macedon. Again, many reports came into the police department, including one where a woman reported seeing a little girl that matched Michelle's description standing outside a fast food burger restaurant. Michelle's autopsy later confirmed that Michelle had eaten a hamburger just before she was murdered. Another report was from a man who recalled seeing a car stopped on the side of the road with a flat tire. When he stopped to see if he could help the driver refused the man's assistance several times. He also reported seeing a little girl who matched Michelle's description sitting in the car, and he noted that it looked like the little girl had been crying. And another driver reported seeing a man who was holding a little girl by the wrist, and he was positive this little girl was Michelle Maenza. And this was at around 5:30 p.m. on November the 26th. The man was standing beside a large beige or tan vehicle with a flat tire. When the driver stopped to offer assistance, the man purposely grabbed the little girl by the wrist and shoved her behind his back, and he just stared at the man with a threatening expression on his face, and it made the driver that stopped to offer assistance feel compelled just to drive away. Michelle's autopsy found that in addition to suffering severe blunt force trauma injuries, she had also been AR'd before being strangled to death from behind using something thin, possibly a thin rope. Michelle had numerous strands of white cat fur all over her clothing. There were also leaves in one of her clenched hands, which matched the vegetation where her body was located. This indicated that she had most likely been strangled there or somewhere nearby. A portion of her palm print was found on her neck, and traces of semen were found on her body and her undergarment. It was also confirmed from a forensic examination of the semen samples that she had been AR'd one time. Police were now almost certain that all 3 girls were linked to the same killer, as all of their names and the towns they resided in were all the same first letter. Thus, the crimes were now being called the alphabet murders. Multiple suspects were investigated, one even being Carmen Colon's uncle. Tragically, many serial R's were uncovered in the Rochester area during this investigation, one being a respected firefighter, Dennis Termini, known as the Garage Artist. He had committed at least 14 known R's on teenage girls and young women. He was also known to have driven a beige car that resembled the one seen by multiple witnesses in these kidnappings. When police surrounded Dennis's home, he shot himself in the head. His body was exhumed in January of 2007. The test findings proved that Dennis was not the one who killed Wanda. but there was no tangible evidence taken from Carmen or Michelle's bodies to compare with Dennis's DNA. Another suspect, Joseph Nassau. Joseph had been sentenced to death row for the killing of 6 women. 4 of these women also had double initials. DNA found on 2 of the victims was destroyed before the modern genetic technology, but the DNA found on Wanda still exists. DNA tests confirmed that Joseph was not connected to the DNA specimen that was collected on Wanda's body. So unless Wanda was killed by someone that wasn't involved in Carmen and Michelle's murder, and police believe that the 3 were linked to the same person, then Joseph was not the perpetrator in the Alphabet murders. Another suspect, serial killer Kenneth Bianchi. He grew up in Rochester before moving to California, where he later became known as the Hillside Strangler. While he does remain a suspect, he has repeatedly denied committing the Alphabet murders. True crime writer Michael Benson, who grew up in Rochester and co-authored the book Nightmare in Rochester, The Double Initial Murders. He believes that Wanda and Michelle were killed by the same person, as their crime scenes and manner of each crime are very similar, but he believes Carmen was killed by someone else. He believes this because there were small differences in the way Carmen was killed, and Carmen's domestic situation was troubling. She was strangled differently and covered with fingernail scratches. It was also reported that Carmen was last seen with 2 people in the car that she was last reported to have been seen in. The main suspect in Carmen Colon's case was her paternal uncle, Miguel Colon. The uncle had developed a bond with her mother after Carmen's parents had split up. Miguel had bought a car very closely resembling the vehicle seen by eyewitnesses before her abduction and her murder. When this car was searched by investigators shortly after she was killed, they found that both the interior and exterior of the car had been thoroughly cleaned, and the trunk had been thoroughly cleaned with a potent cleaning solution. Additionally, there was a child's doll that was discovered in his car. This was despite Carmen's relatives telling police that she frequently rode in Miguel's car and might have left the toy there. In addition, a buddy claimed that Miguel told him he planned to leave the nation 2 days after his niece passed away because he had done something wrong in Rochester. 4 days after his niece's murder, from Rochester to Puerto Rico. No physical evidence linking Miguel to the murder was discovered at the scene of the crime or inside his vehicle. This was even though there was a significant amount of circumstantial evidence that he was guilty. In 1991, Miguel took his own life inside his home on Radio Street in Rochester. This was after a domestic dispute in which he shot and wounded his then-wife and brother-in-law. Benson also believes that the victim's double initials are just a coincidence and has no relation to the killings at all. He says that there is no logical reason for the double initials to be a factor in this case. It is an interesting coincidence, but it's a tremendous leap to say that it is why they were chosen for death. What is known is that during the time era when these girls were born, matching initials was a very popular trend for new parents when naming their new babies. So it is possible that the names and towns all sharing the same first letter could be just a coincidence. But the police still believes that they are all connected to the same killer. The only witness report that could give a slight description of a man who had the flat tire and refused to help was made into a sketch, but the suspect's sketch has never been identified. Even though more than 800 probable suspects were questioned by investigators regarding the Alphabet murders, no one has ever been apprehended. In March of 2022, A TikToker posted that her grandfather might have been behind the Alphabet murders, saying that he might have had a brown car like the one that the killer was suspected to have, and that he owned a grocery store where cats prowled around in the basement looking for rats, and white cat hair was found on the clothes of all 3 victims. Her grandfather also spoke with Wanda on the day of her disappearance, and even offered a reward when she went missing. Her grandfather had never been considered a suspect. A retired police officer who now works as a private investigator believes that a Rochester man jailed for 30 years is most likely the killer of Wanda and Michelle. This man was jailed for up to 25 years in 1987 for R-ing an 11-year-old the previous year, and was then detained under civil confinement in Westmoreland Prison in New York after a court decided he was too dangerous to be released. Civil confinement is the formal legal process by which a person convicted of a violent sexual offense may be kept in prison upon completion of their sentence if a court believes that they are still a threat to society. This man lived in the same neighborhood as Wanda and Michelle, and they may have even known him, or they may have seen him as an authority figure when he spoke to them. And he was free at the time of their murders. He was not incarcerated, and he had a horrific record. Michael Benson became his prison pen pal, and this suspect sent him all sorts of materials. Even after all of the intense investigations and arrest of key suspects, the Alphabet murders remain one of the most hurting, unsolved murders in U.S. history. However, the families of the victims still hope that justice may be served one day. Today, over 50 years later, and with many of the original suspects dead, the Alphabet murders will likely forever remain unsolved.